I'm in New York for the third stage of this trip with Knowledge Exchange Violin to the USA. I'm standing in Central Park, just a few hundred meters away from the Metropolitan Museum. I have 3 days exploration there, ending with the day of filming, working with a set of instruments from the museum, one Grancino, one Steiner viola, one Amati, and one Stradivari instrument. And over the next 2 days, I'll begin to come to a little bit more refinement as to what I'm going to record on them on Wednesday and film on them. It's always an interesting question working with instruments, particularly when you want to make a document which reflects on what those instruments are and what they might mean. What do you do with them? It's particularly interesting because two of the instruments we're going to use, the Stradivari and the Amati violins, are both in Baroque setup. They were returned to Baroque setup in the 1970s in Amsterdam, and that gives us an interesting extra layer in as much as they represent thinking on what informed practice would have been 50 years ago. To get that into context, that would be like me saying at the end of the First World War, thinking about how Schumann or Brahms might have thought about playing Bach. And I think it's really important to reflect on that and not simply say, oh, we don't like the way the instruments were returned to Baroque setup in the second half of the 20th century. Ideas have moved on, but it's also exciting, I think, to explore what those ideas were in the first and second German generations of the early music revival. In fact, the Stradivari instrument is the only Stradivari violin which is in early setup. So that's exciting in itself. They're both instruments I know well. I've performed on the Stradivari before. And I'm not quite sure which of the repertoire that I've brought with me I'm going to use. I have a feeling that for all four instruments I may play Matthäus on all of them, Nicola Matthäus, and I may play Colombi on all of them. The reason for that is because I'm interested in the idea between Italian instruments that traveled or instruments which were influenced by Italian instruments and Italian players who either travel or didn't travel. And so Colombi and Matthäus fit that bill very nicely. Then there's an interesting challenge, which is the Grancino instrument, which at some point in the last 30 years was set up as a sort of viola d'amore without sympathetic strings. It's not a viola d'amore. It's one of four instruments from around about 1700, all made at the same time, all identical, all what you might call garlanded instruments, which may have been what we call a violetta, though nobody can really agree what a violetta is. So it's an interesting challenge, one working on a chordophone, a string instrument, which really hasn't been played on for the past century, and two, dealing with the fact that nobody really knows what to do with it. So I'm going to explore the possibility of using some different pieces from that era, from around about 1690 to 1700, 1710, which explore different ways of setting up string instruments. So I'm probably going to use Wilsmeyer for sure, because he's writing at the end of the quite great age of scordatura, and he's writing pieces which I'm not entirely sure were entirely intended for violins. And also, naturally, Matthäus, because Matthäus is maybe somewhat incorrectly credited by John Evelyn with introducing the viola d'amore, but actually what Evelyn talks about is an instrument played d'amore style, which is something very different. But that's a good excuse to play with that stuff. And then there's a fantastic, absolutely amazing 1660 Jakob Steiner viola, which, as well as playing contemporaneous music on it, the composer Michael Alec Rose is traveling here from Nashville. He's written a piece especially for it, and not just for the instrument, but also for the idea of the instrument in the museum. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. I'm standing here in the middle of Central Park, which is one of my favorite places. I'm not often here in autumn. And one thing that really strikes me is there are more birds around me than I've ever seen in the park, except in one particularly hard winter when it seemed as if all the birds were begging for food. So I'm going to go over now to the museum, which is just over there, and start work.